Good evening, good evening. I wanted to tell you that this is the third copy of The Art of Rivalry by tonight's speaker, Sebastian Smee, that I've had to buy this month. You might think I'm forgetful and I've lost copies. Rather, I've been very eager to read this Pulitzer Prize winning author's book, as I'm sure some of you have and or will. And as I travel, people see the cover, the title, Four Friendships, Betrayals, and Breakthroughs in Modern Art, talking about Matisse and Picasso, or Pollock and de Kooning. It's a great read. You think about friendships, but they always sometimes have a little bit of an edge to it. So I recommend the book highly to you, and it sheds light on interesting relationships. Who was the greatest American artist of the late 40s and early 50s? It was a tug of war in the media between Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. So I'm here to introduce the speaker. I've met many of you, of course, yet I still consider myself fairly new here. Stephanie Stiebisch, the Margaret and Terry Stent Director of Smithsonian American Art Museum, and also the Renwick Gallery. So again, you're in for a treat. You are here at the second in the series of three lectures. These are the Clarice Smith Distinguished Lectures in American Art. We are fortunate to have, did I call her Claire? Yeah. How about Clarice? We are fortunate to have Clarice Smith here with us. As you may know, Clarice Smith is an artist, a commissioner of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and our delightful supporter for this series, which has a terrific balance. Every year we have three speakers, and you understand what the rhythm is. Art historian, Sylvia Yunt from the Metropolitan Museum of Art first, an art critic, Sebastian Smee, and an artist. So it's really a great balance of things. So, what do you not know about Sebastian Smee that I can tell you? Those of you who read the Boston Globe are happy to have him as your art critic. He writes a very popular column called Frame by Frame, and it looks at individual works in museums throughout New England. So it's a really terrific way to get to know works of art and also the museums that hold them in trust. As I mentioned earlier, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2011. And he came to Boston from down under. He's originally from Australia, and he was last in Sydney, where he served as national art critic for The Australian for 4 years, between 2004 and 2008. Before that, he was in the United Kingdom, and he was on the staff of various publications you may know: the Art Newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, The Independent, The Times, The Financial Times, Prospect Magazine, and Spectator. He wrote for all of those. He was only on the staff of the Art Newspaper, which is terrific. So sometimes you wonder, where do books come from? Certainly I think they come from articles and such. And in some cases, I would also offer it came about through a friendship that Sebastian had with a terrific British artist, Lucian Freud. And I think in that conversation, one asks about relationships, mentorships, and certainly there's a great chapter on Lucian Freud's relationship with Francis Bacon. In his free time, which I'm not sure how that works, he teaches nonfiction writing at Wellesley College. So if you know anybody at Wellesley, send him Sebastian's way. I would tell you also that this talk tonight, Sebastian tells me, is not particularly about his book, although your questions can be about the book. It's perhaps the beginnings of his next book. It's a more personal exploration and also features the important role of art museums, which we all know and love. His title is Art and Darkness: The Benefits and Otherwise of Being in the Dark. Well, we're in the dark, but we're together with Sebastian tonight, so I think we're in good company. Please give a Washington, D.C. welcome to Sebastian Smee.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Stephanie, for that very, very warm introduction. I really appreciate it. I want to thank not only Stephanie, but the staff here at the Smithsonian Art Museums, American Art Museums, I should say, and of course, Clarice Smith for her wonderful patronage of this lecture series. Last year, around the same time that I noticed the Washington Post had begun printing a new motto under its banner, "Democracy dies in darkness," an old yearning of mine seemed to return with a force that surprised me. And this was supposed to bring up an image, so there we go, thank you. It was a yearning to be in the dark, to venture ever further back into darkness. Now, as someone who's worked for newspapers, as Stephanie said, with great pride for almost all his adult life, I'm ashamed to admit it, but the truth is I had a yearning to get away from being better informed, to get away from Twitter feeds and targeted advertisements, away from statistics, metrics, algorithms, 10 things you need to know lists, and museum wall texts even. It may be that I simply needed a break. I'd been a jobbing art critic since I was 23. Of course, getting paid to go to museums and then write about what you've seen is a joy and a privilege, and in the eyes of most of my friends and family, a bit of a scam. But it also involves, like any job in journalism, a lot of deadlines and lots of travel. And these days too, endless hours on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So, I took the break. We took it. In January of this year, my wife and I returned with our 2 kids to our native Australia for a kind of sabbatical year. Over the winter break in Australia, we had guests from the US, dear friends, and we took them up north to the Great Barrier Reef. Our friends, who are great readers, recommended a recent novel by Rachel Cusk, you may have heard of it, called Outline. And here's another embarrassing thing for a critic to admit. When it comes to novels, I rarely act on others' recommendations. I have my own bedside pile of books. I'm a painfully slow reader, and I tend to resent outside interference. But my friends are exceptions. They know me very well, better, I suspect, than any online algorithm, and they have great judgment. So I began reading the book in the hotel the day after we all returned from snorkeling on the reef. And I should say that this was my first time snorkeling. And I guess I was struck powerfully by what probably strikes everyone. One moment you're above the surface of the water, where all you can see is a vast, undifferentiated expanse of opaque, wrinkled water, a sort of scrim of undulating concavities and convexities stretching to the horizon like digital ones and zeros. And then, a split second later, you've entered an alternative, three-dimensional universe. You're in a kind of dream space, looking down at mountainous accretions of strange colored coral to the soundtrack of your own heavy breathing. Giant clams, dazzling fish in all shapes and sizes, crazy colors, and everywhere, of course, this strange, caressing, dark, heaving element, the water. The line dividing the two is so thin, but the difference is vast. I swam for 10 minutes with a turtle, not knowing where it would lead me. The whole experience took place in a weird and dreamlike slow motion. I knew the names of nothing I saw. I became profoundly disoriented. It was as if I were in a great old museum at night, a kind of 17th century Wunderkammer, hung floor to ceiling with no one else about, and with the unexpected ability to levitate. Anyway, back in the hotel, I picked up Rachel Cusk's Outline. This is the image that's on the cover by Man Ray. A few pages in, the narrator, a writer flying to Athens from London, is talking with the Greek man seated beside her. He has with him a popular novel by Wilbur Smith. But because he's picked the narrator for a writer with rather more highbrow sensibilities, he's embarrassed to be caught with such a trashy-looking novel. So he mumbles something awkward and stashes it away in his bag. The narrator observes this, but as it happened, she tells us, and I'm quoting here, I was no longer interested in literature as a form of snobbery or even of self-definition. I had no desire to prove that one book was better than another. In fact, she says, and this for me was the key part, if I read something I admired, I found myself increasingly disinclined to mention it at all. What I knew personally to be true had come to seem unrelated to the process of persuading others. I did not any longer want to persuade anyone of anything. Now, we know by this point in the novel that the narrator is living in the aftermath of a marital breakup. So it's unclear, and we remain in the dark about this throughout the novel, whether the condition she describes is related to her own slightly unanchored, shell-shocked state of mind, or whether it reflects some deeper recognition about art, a recognition that, if you think about it, would militate not only against friendly recommendations, but against art criticism and education, and the whole edifice of assumptions on which our marvelous museums and what we call culture as a whole are constructed. Because, of course, if what you know personally to be true no longer feels related to the process of persuading others, all those things could be said to be in serious trouble. Either way, the passage in outline articulated with uncanny accuracy how I myself had begun to feel. There was a period there when I didn't want to persuade anyone of anything. If I saw a great painting or read a wonderful new book, I had little or no urge to share the news. This was strange because I think I'm known in Boston, if I'm known at all, as a critic who's unafraid to express enthusiasm, sometimes even in gauche or gushing ways. But for a time, the idea of explaining why I thought a work of art was great or of persuading others to see the quality I saw in it had begun to seem almost pointless and somehow even foolish. This condition may or may not be a malaise to take seriously, but it could be said to be a problem if you're an art critic. If your job is precisely to present opinions on art and exhibitions every week in a public forum, and then to tweet about these opinions, to put them on Instagram and Facebook, and from there to count up clicks and comments and engagement time, presumably with a view to measuring your own worth, your opinion's persuasiveness, and your ultimate value to some unspoken, larger social enterprise. Interestingly, Cusk's confession that if she read something she admired, she found herself increasingly disinclined to mention it at all, also chimed with something the painter Lucian Freud once said, an offhand sounding statement which for some reason I've always loved. When you find something very moving, he said, it almost makes you want to know less about it. Rather like when falling in love, you don't want to meet the parents. And so it struck me that if the narrator's opinion in Cusk's novel was an expression of alienation or disaffection, Lucian Freud's formulation seemed to put a more positive, not to say humorous, spin on the same impulse. Not wanting to know more about something, not wanting to share it or analyze it, or in any way speak about it for fear of spoiling it, was something that happened, Freud implied, when you were deeply moved by it, when you were in some way falling in love. It seems, as I said, like a casual thing to have said, a bit of intellectual loose change, but over the years, as it's rattled around in my head, I have to say this idea has become more and more magnetic for me, and almost darkly seductive. I'm not sort of explaining all these images, but you might recognize this as a wonderful Adams work from Summer Nights Walking, one of my favorite books of photography. In my mind, it connects art not only with falling in love, but with inner life, and perhaps even with belief itself. I don't necessarily mean religious belief. I simply mean the kind of belief that makes it possible to locate our true selves and to proceed from there with a feeling of agency in our own lives. And in the specific, a feeling of agency in the mystery or the specific quiddity of our own lives. The kind of belief that makes it possible not to get stuck in endless knowingness. Knowingness I define as a condition of mind that affecting shrewdness or wisdom is actually the product of received or predigested ideas of how to be. In Rachel Cusk's outline, which is partly about the effort it can take not to get stuck in other people's knowingness, their narratives, their limiting versions of wisdom, the narrator briefly mentions her marriage breakup. She says that, among other things, a marriage is a system of belief. And though it manifests itself in things that are real enough, a house, let's say, or a family holiday, the impulse that drives it is ultimately mysterious. And I happen to think it's the same with art. People seem to believe in it, and that belief manifests itself in things that are real enough, paintings, museums, exhibitions, reviews, and so on. but they don't always examine the assumptions underlying that belief. And those assumptions, I worry, may be more vulnerable than we think. In outline, the narrator's Greek companion from the seat beside her proceeds to reflect on his own first marriage. He recalls that for as long as the marriage survived, he had, and I quote, lived almost unconsciously. He was absorbed in it as you can be absorbed in a book, believing in its events and living entirely through its characters. He notes that he hasn't been able to be absorbed in life in that way since the marriage collapsed. People do talk, don't they, about being married to their work, which I've never quite been able to relate to. But by the end of last year, I have to admit that I'd begun to feel that my marriage to my job, such as it was in jeopardy, that my belief in the whole web of assumptions that linked artists to galleries and museums and curators and to critics and to newspapers and social media was listing to one side like a rusty old ship that had collided with a coral reef on a dark night. The deeper feeling I had was that I was in danger of losing something. It was hard to define, hard to see the outline of the thing I was afraid of losing, and hard to understand its exact relationship to me. But it chimed, I felt, with something Alice Munro once wrote in a story. In her own house, confessed Munro's narrator, and I quote again, "I seem to be often looking for a place to hide, sometimes from the children, but more often from the jobs to be done and the phone ringing and the sociability of the neighborhood. I wanted to hide," she wrote, "so I could get busy at my real work, which was a sort of wooing of distant parts of myself." This feeling, or something like it at any rate, became increasingly important to me. I wanted to woo the distant parts of myself that seemed to be disappearing over the horizon. Strangely, I knew that this feeling was connected in some way to powerful experiences I'd had with art. I knew too that most of those had taken place in museums. One such experience I can tell you occurred in Sydney when I was in my early 20s, a year or two before I'd become an art critic. I entered a museum and soon found myself standing in a small, darkened room, surrounded on four sides by blurred black and white photographs of pedestrians in crowded city streets. I say crowded and city and streets, but the location and nature of these ghostly human congregations were unclear. The people, all of different ages, were shown in various aspects of isolation and tender attachment. They were enveloped in shifting accretions of darkness, their hands and faces picked out by pooling, smoky light. What I felt as I stood there was not unlike what I felt when I went snorkeling this year and first put my head below the surface of the ocean. I was suddenly in a new reality, which was also, and this was the breathtaking thing, my own, but made deeper and somehow more enduring. It was as if I'd broken the surface of something and had entered a dream, or as if the skin-tight pocket of time I occupied had suddenly become immensely elastic, and I was now intimately connected, not just to these anonymous, faraway faces, but to something much older, something infinitely tender, but also elusive and unknowable. I honestly ascribe the beginning of my love of art to this moment. It's one of the main reasons I became a critic. But as I said a moment ago, I had a sense that this kind of experience was in jeopardy, that I might no longer have the same kind of access to it. And that in fact my job as an art critic, even though it involved visiting museums and looking at art, an enormous privilege, had become an impediment in some way. In fact, I found myself thinking about the figure of Martha in the story from Luke's Gospel. I knew the story less, I have to admit, from the Bible than from a painting of it in London's National Gallery by the young Velázquez. Velázquez shows Martha in the foreground preparing a meal. She's annoyed by the fact that her sister Mary, instead of helping her in the kitchen, has abandoned her duties in order to sit at the feet of Jesus. In the painting, we see them through a serving hatch, or perhaps reflected in a mirror. But in any case, they appear muffled and blurred by distance, as if what's going on between them is in some sense underwater. Not only profound, but for Martha, distant, difficult to approach. Martha, meanwhile, is in the foreground. Her face and all her kitchen tools and ingredients are rendered with such clarity that they almost ping. And of course, this is Velázquez's way of emphasizing Martha's dilemma, literally foregrounding the question of what she should do. In the Gospel, and Forgive me if this is starting to sound like a sermon. It's certainly not intended that way. Busy Martha approaches Jesus saying, "Don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." But Jesus replies, "Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one." Blurred in the background, Jesus represents, I suppose you could say, love, forgiveness, the whole New Testament package. But in this particular story, what he represents more specifically, I think, is inner life, the idea of attending to what matters. Whenever I see it, it reminds me of something Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav once wrote. "Just as the hand held before the eye conceals the greatest mountain," he said, "so the little earthly life hides from the glance the enormous lights and mysteries of which the world is full. And he who can draw it away from before his eyes, as one draws away a hand, beholds the great shining of the inner worlds." It was no coincidence that my family's little earthly life in the few months before we left Boston was extremely consuming. The months from Halloween to the holidays are always like that in America. But it felt more so because I was doing a lot of traveling and speaking about my book, and also because as a family we were constantly saying goodbye to people. Inevitably, the social gatherings where we said these goodbyes involved a lot of explaining and of repeating the same things again and again. Yes, we were coming back. Yes, we considered Boston home. No, we didn't mind the winters. And no, we weren't overly freaked out by the new political situation. But I could tell that many people found these assurances unconvincing, perhaps because in the same breath, and probably just out of habit, I'd also refer to Australia as home. So I suppose it was obvious that I didn't quite know where my true self belonged. Sometimes when you're in a lot of different social situations in a concentrated period of time, you repeat yourself. You hear more or less the same things in response, and gradually things come to feel formulaic, unreal. You lose track of yourself. You're busy, but you feel blurred, like a bad copy, or like someone in the kitchen who does all the cooking but never gets to eat. I'm talking a lot here about myself, I realize, and I apologize. But I do wonder whether the symptoms I'm describing are simply my problem alone. I wonder if it doesn't also describe, at least to some extent, the situation of society as a whole. We're almost all living in a state of constant distraction. Our already threadbare inner lives are being flushed out, forced to the surface, externalized by algorithms, their outlines dissolved in the endless chatter of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all of which is produced, as Daniel Mendelsohn wrote, and I quote, "a newly pervasive, permeable, and transient sense of self, in which much of the experience, feeling, and emotion that used to exist within the confines of the self, in intimate relations and in tangible, unchanging objects, has migrated to the phone, to the digital cloud, and to the shape-shifting judgments of the crowd." In this new situation, it can sometimes seem as if searchlights are raking back and forth across the surface of our separate selves, bleaching and blurring everything they illuminate, and turning the idea of the soul itself, which was always perhaps to some extent a fiction, but at its best a dark, extravagant, spellbinding one, into a fungible entity, a binary construct of ones and zeros. Some commentators have noticed an unconscious tendency in the lives we now live online to reduce ourselves in order to, quote, fit the software, to make a computer's description of us more accurate. We know, as Zadie Smith wrote when The Social Network, that movie, came out, that having 2,000 Facebook friends is not what it looks like. We know that we are using the software to behave in a certain superficial way towards others. But do we know, are we alert to what the software is doing to us? Is it possible that what is communicated between people online eventually becomes their truth? A researcher, Michael Kaczynski, recently showed that on the basis of an average of just 68 Facebook likes, it was possible to predict a user's skin color with 95% accuracy, her sexual orientation with 88% accuracy, and her political affiliation with 85% accuracy. Just 70 likes was enough to outdo what a person's friends knew about her, 150 to outdo what her parents knew, and just 300 likes would enable Facebook to surpass what even her partner knew. But Facebook, of course, is just the beginning. As software, it is relatively primitive. It doesn't approach what's made possible by the growing proximity to human consciousness, that scientists are already achieving in the field of artificial intelligence. Siri and her avatar friends, who are getting more sophisticated and responsive all the time, have a lot to offer. There has been, as one of Rachel Cusk's characters in her novel Transit points out, and I quote here, "a great harvest of language and information from life," unquote. And it may be, as the same character says, that the faux human, F-A-U-X human, is growing more substantial and more relational than the original, that there's potentially more tenderness to be had from a machine than from our fellow humans. After all, the character continues, the mechanized interface was the distillation not of one, but of many. It could even be soothing to think that this chorus of distilled wisdom, helpfulness, compassion, or love is affixed not to any one person, but to an aggregation of people, a sort of harvest of knowingness, which seems to come both from everywhere and nowhere. In this sense, the erosion of individuality, the character notes, could also be seen as the erosion of the power to hurt. So, of course, by the same logic, we could wonder, as many have, about the efficacy of employing individual critics who can wield such a disproportionate power to hurt, when we could have aggregations of thousands and even millions of opinions. The only response I would tentatively propose already feels somewhat nostalgic. Criticism, I could say, is the record of a specific engagement with a specific experience by a specific human being, one inner life aiming to connect with another, and in this way providing an alternative to the manufactured consensus and to paid publicity. The judgment of such specific human beings, each one imperfect but autonomous, outlines rather than blurs, remains more meaningful in human terms than a disembodied soup-like aggregation. But perhaps this is wrong. What it is to be human appears to be changing rather quickly. Discussions of these kinds of issues often focus on the idea of privacy. People hear about the information gathering powers of the tech giants, and they worry about privacy. By privacy, they mean the right not to be under constant surveillance, and also, I assume, the right to be free from unwanted political control or commercial exploitation. But that horse, I would say, is pretty much bolted. Facebook was already, as the British author John Lanchester wrote, the biggest surveillance-based enterprise in the history of mankind. It knows, he said, far, far more about you than the most intrusive government has ever known about its citizens. Freedom from this kind of surveillance is, of course, a very important issue. But the idea of privacy from which it grows is a shallow concept, I believe, compared with the related idea of what used to be called inner life. Like freedom itself, inner life is hard to define except negatively. It's not a literal description, it's a metaphor, and in some ways a misleading one. I'm not sure, for instance, that it is in fact inner. That's to say, I don't know if it can be located inside us, even figuratively. Just as often it seems to come into play when we feel ourselves to be in an intensely charged relationship with things or people or works of art that are outside us. When we are wooing those distant parts of ourselves that Alice Munro wrote about. And yet, even so, I think it's more substantive and in a way more real than even the idea of freedom. If we listen to people who have lost their freedom, but who somehow, despite forced confinement, constant surveillance, and even torture, manage to preserve their inner life, they'll confirm this. Inner life has to do, I assume, with your age and personal history, with the ebb and flow of chemicals inside your brain, and with your body's itches and aches. But also, I would say, with your apprehensions of beauty, your intimations of death, what's going on inside you when you're in love, or when your whole being is in turmoil. Inner life carries on at a night's leaps removed from opinions and politics, from news headlines and from the tailored ads that appear algorithmically in your inbox. It's obscurely affected by the weather, by the angle of the sun's rays overhead, and by shifts in atmospheric pressure. Perhaps also by the last great book you read, your most recent humiliation, or the last intensely beautiful person you saw in the street. But all this in ways you would struggle ever to put into words. Everyone has an inner life. Your inner life is not more admirable if you look at art or read novels. Not at all. But music and art and books do provide us, I think, with an opportunity to become more aware of our inner lives, more attentive to them, more thoughtful about them, and perhaps more beguiled and in awe of them. For me, as I suggested earlier, museums have always been a place to go where I can feel in touch with this inner life. Museums are, of course, treasure houses of memory in an era ravaged by short attention spans. But they're also, strange to say, places where you can go to forget things. You can go to them to forget not just the noise and distraction of everyday life, but all the things in your life, from kitchen chores to clearing your email inbox, that are necessary but not perhaps fundamentally important. Museums are housed, of course, in physical buildings. And just as different computer software embeds different ideas about how we should relate to one another, museum architecture expresses very different ideas about how we should relate to art. And that's what I want to talk about now, because the shapes and forms museums take are all knowing attempts, you could say, to mold our inner lives, to frame and even to manipulate our experience of art. Last year, I led a school excursion with a fellow parent, Steve, to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. My own children, who go to a small public school in nearby Somerville, have been there many times, but many of their classmates had never been. In fact, they had very little experience of art museums in general. Something occurred in the first half hour of that excursion that stayed with me. There was an unusual show, Mega Cities Asia, which was a series of large, spectacular installations placed in different galleries throughout the museum. So Steve and I led the kids off the bus and straight for an obscure, rarely visited part of the museum, the Korean gallery, because I knew that in the next room was an installation that was part of Mega Cities Asia. I hoped it would get their attention. It was a single room covered in reflective mirrors with a giant rotating chandelier in the center. It was dazzling. You walk in and wow, everything is illuminated. It's a great place for selfies, very Instagram ready. But from there, we led the kids immediately upstairs to the galleries for Japanese art. We gave them 5 minutes, told them they could roam freely, and suggested only that they look for both the biggest object they could find and the smallest. There was some tiny netsuke, those little handheld Japanese carvings in the gallery we were in. And in the smaller adjacent gallery, some giant and very old Buddhist sculptures. The expressions on the faces of some of them were deeply serene, as you might expect, but others, the tomb guardians, were explosively angry. The sculpture gallery at the MFA is by far the darkest space in the museum. Very dim spotlights target the sculptures, just enough to cast dramatic shadows on the walls behind. After about 5 minutes, I wandered into this gallery, which I'd seen so many times that I tend to take it for granted. And more and more of the students were congregating there. Their voices were hushed, although no one had actually told them to keep quiet. And as soon as I entered, a boy who I later learned had never before been to an art museum rushed up to me. He tugged my arm and said, excuse me, Tom's dad, what should I do?" The question threw me. To my shame, I think I might even have laughed. But he was absolutely in earnest. His eyes were popping. He was completely out of his comfort zone. And he was almost bouncing up and down with excitement and anxiety. What should I do? I suppose there were two ways I could have taken the question. One would be to see it as an innocent cry for help. Here was a boy who was a little overwhelmed and simply needed some guidance, something to hang on to. In which case I could have tried to tame the wildness of what he was experiencing by telling him a few pertinent facts about the sculptures or pointing him to the wall labels. That's how learning works, right? That's the business of enlightenment. And isn't enlightenment what encyclopedic museums like the MFA are all about? But the thing is, I actually envied his state of bewilderment. Good art happens to us in ways that knock us out of our educations, wrote Peter Sheldal, one of my esteemed forerunners in this series. And something like this was perhaps going on now, I thought, both for the boy and for me. As I looked around now, those sculptures suddenly seemed twice the size and 3 times as menacing. So the other possibility, I suppose, was just to let him be, to let him experience whatever it was he was experiencing. And in fact, that's more or less what I did, not because I'd reflected deeply on it, but because there were 30 students and 5 teachers milling about, and it was time to get cracking. But ever since that day, I've wanted to take this little boy's question seriously. And I've wanted to address the answer not only to a child, but to myself. What should we do when we feel disoriented and in the dark? What's valuable about this state? What can art teach us about it? But also, what might we want from it beyond its being a teaching moment, an obligation to learn something, to enter into the game of knowingness? How can it be valued as an experience in and of itself, an experience that knocks us out of our educations and throws us and our inner lives into a kind of animating doubt? You find in cities with great encyclopedic museums that they often have a nearby museum that's much smaller, more private, and somehow more mysterious or eccentric. Down the road from the Met in New York, for instance, is the Frick. Not far from the National Gallery in London is the Wallace Collection. In DC, you have, of course, the Phillips Collection. Tokyo has the beautiful Nezu Museum. And in Paris, not far from the Louvre, is the Musée Jacquemart-André. But the greatest example of what I have in mind, because in many ways it's the weirdest, is in Boston. Just across the road from the MFA is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, where the MFA is in a building which announces its intention to civilize and educate its viewers from the moment they approach it. The Gardner is a more eccentric and mysterious place. Isabella Stewart Gardner designed it in a very particular way. She created an opaque exterior and surrounded the building with a high wall with trellises, a carriage house, and tall trees. In the old days, as you entered the building from the Fenway, you were immediately thrown into a new setting. A cloistered courtyard, high interior walls deliberately reminiscent of a Venetian palazzo, a skylight, palm trees, flowers, antiquities. The effect was and is intended to be beautiful, spellbinding, strange, not unlike Venice, the mazy, sea-sluiced city that inspired it. Even as you proceeded to walk through the different rooms, which in the afternoons could be disconcertingly dark, you weren't really supposed to know which works of art were more valuable or critically esteemed than others. Instead, Gardner wanted you to remain pliable and open, beguiled and in a state of heightened receptivity. For both Henry James and John Lafarge, the museum was almost like poetry, an experience to succumb to rather than analyze. It was intentionally mysterious. Which is interesting, because in museum culture today, with only a few exceptions, it's as if it's no longer desirable to create situations where the viewer is credited with the maturity and independence to be left alone, one-on-one, in a state of animating uncertainty with art. All over the world, instead, we see an inescapable impulse on the part of institutions to explain, edify, welcome, orient, and predigest. Nothing, according to this way of thinking, should be too surprising. Lighting must be uniform and bright information, information clear and ingratiating, help and amenities always close at hand. But Mrs. Gardner belongs to an earlier era, an era of amateur art lovers. In many ways, of course, her vision was fanciful and even absurd. The very premise, a Venetian-style palazzo in Boston, is almost embarrassing. But sometimes follies of this kind remind us of alternative possibilities, different ways of seeing. I think we've seen recent evidence that some people involved in museums are getting more interested in these different ways of seeing. The most striking example I can think of is actually in Tasmania, in Australia. It's a museum called Mona, or the Museum of Old and New Art. I went there with my wife earlier this month, and I'm still not sure how I feel about it. It was established in 2009 in what used to be a winery just outside of Hobart on the Derwent River. It's not a transparent modernist box like an Apple store or like the new extension at the Gardner, nor is it in the mould of the great encyclopedic museums with their Greek columns and pediments and grand staircases leading us up to higher things. Instead, Mona looms above the river, as the Tasmanian author Richard Flanagan wrote in The New Yorker, like a post-apocalyptic fortress. The whole building seems to embody a kind of obsession with darkness. To see the art, you have to descend several levels from the entrance lobby via a spiral staircase surrounding a glass elevator, and then traverse a deep passageway cut into Triassic sandstone. The first thing you see at the bottom of your descent is a bar, presumably to get you in the mood. After proceeding down the long corridor, you tumble into a series of suggestive, dim spaces, both claustrophobic and sometimes expansive. Some of the works are deliberately shocking and preoccupied with sex and bodily functions. The spaces are linked by ramps, angled staircases, and bridges that hark back to Piranesi's prisons. David Walsh, its founder, grew up in a small clapboard cottage in a poor part of Hobart, and then in his teens in a slum housing block. School was harsh. He was very shy too. But he survived because he lived, according to Flanagan, in the endlessly rich world of his own mind, leavened by his loves, the universe of books, the infinity of the cosmos, which he studied nightly, and the dusty mysteries of the old Tasmanian Museum, where he wandered when he was meant to be at Mass. Walsh had an extraordinary brain for numbers too. And so later, and this is an amazing story in itself actually, he made a fortune at gambling by figuring out how to beat the house. But even directing teams of underlings to place bets in casinos, which had banned him personally across the world, wasn't exciting enough for him. So he bought a collection of antiquities and a piece of land and turned it into his own museum. I actually went there back in the early 2000s and liked it enough. But for Walsh, it was too predictable. No one came. He realized it was generic. It looked like every other museum, he said. So he started dreaming up alternatives. And in doing so, he began to question everything he'd been told about modern museums. The white walls, the explanatory texts, the conventions of lighting, the whole idea of the museum as a kind of classroom and opportunity for edification. He became interested in Wunderkammern, which is sometimes called cabinets of curiosity. In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Wunderkammern, or wonder chambers, were a favoured way for European royalty and nobility to display their collections of art together with natural phenomena like rock crystals and mineral specimens, nautilus shells, reptiles, birds, mammals, and coral, as well as man-made delights from automatons and clocks to Venetian glass, Persian manuscripts, and ancient jewellery. The fabulous, the fantastic, and the fake, as Flanagan wrote, were all thrown and shown together in a spirit of enchanted wonder. Wunderkammern were products of the Age of Enlightenment and of exploration. Sorry, I should say product of the Age of Exploration, of that period of early global trade, of conflict and conquest and exploitation. They reflected a curiosity and a thirst for knowledge that fed directly into the European Enlightenment and the systems of classification and knowledge it spawned. They led into the modern encyclopedic museum, of course, too. But there remained for a time something unformed and intellectually primitive about Wunderkammern, something that foregrounded whim, fantasy, mystery, and beguilement ahead of knowledge, authority, and power. Darkness and doubt over illumination and knowingness. What finally interests me about places like the Gardner and Mona, and there are many other examples, both old museums and recent ones, like Tadao Ando's astonishing Chichu Museum on the island of Naoshima in Japan. What interests me is not the eccentric vision of the founder, but the darkness itself and the way that it can perhaps act as a metaphor for the wildness, the confusion, and the wonders of inner life. One of the reasons it interests me is that the idea of darkness embodied by these private museums, as they embrace various forms of not knowing, seems to bring us closer at times to what artists themselves have always said about the process of creation. Great artists almost always talk, don't they, about being in the dark as they create, about not knowing exactly what it is they're doing at the very moment that they're working with maximum intensity. If anything ever does work, in my case, said Francis Bacon, it works from that moment when consciously I don't know what I'm doing. In a similar vein, the South African artist William Kentridge has described art as a way of arriving at knowledge that is not subject to cross-examination, which on the face of it seems almost a troubling claim, doesn't it? And especially strange coming as it does from a man who is the son of famous human rights lawyers. The idea of knowledge being not subject to cross-examination seems almost contrary to all the values our civilization was built on. And yet, when applied to the mystery of artistic creation, it does somehow make sense. The greatest art doesn't seem to require cross-examination. It almost prefers silence. When we hear one of Schubert's late piano sonatas performed by a Mitsuko Uchida, when we stand in front of a Frida Kahlo self-portrait, when we put down a great story by Chekhov or Alice Munro, or when we emerge blinking from a mysterious movie like Ingmar Bergman's Persona, what is there finally to say? Isn't the deepest response to art the feeling that words and conversation, persuasion and recommendation are somehow beside the point and may even besmirch what we've just experienced? Personally, I love that private collection museums like the Gardner and Mona exist. They act as a kind of antidote, I think, to the big encyclopedic museums. They seem to focus our attention more on those dark stirrings of curiosity and creativity than on systems of classification and knowingness. They're eccentric, yes, but they seem committed to intensifying the experience of art. Those big museums, by contrast, can sometimes seem to want to co-opt art for other purposes: education, self-improvement, community building, and so on. But there's also a problem with these smaller private museums, isn't there? It's that as you navigate them, you can't help but feel their creators looking over your shoulder. You sort of feel yourself cajoled, even bullied into buying into their peculiar way of seeing things. At Mona, for instance, you have to cross the campus to get to the museum entrance, and as you do, you pass a private car park with two spaces, one reserved for God, that would be David Walsh, and the one beside it for God's mistress, that would be his wife. You simply can't escape Walsh's overbearing celebrity presence, which makes itself felt not just in the museum, which is a huge popular hit, but all over Hobart, where he's rightly credited with supercharging the local economy and changing the face of the city. At the Gardner, meanwhile, you may marvel at the idiosyncratic mind that had the vision to create all this, but you may also wonder whether you would have liked Mrs. Gardner, whether she was eccentric in a sympathetic way or in a controlling, somewhat irritating, ultimately exhausting way. And such questions, I find, have a tendency to interfere with your experience in front of the art you've gone there to see. The great Titian, for instance, the Rembrandt self-portrait, the Piero della Francesca. You can try to resist the tendency, you can put it out of your mind, but to tell someone that Gardner affixed a favourite swatch of cloth to the back of Titian's Europa, one of the greatest paintings anywhere in America, is to make it difficult to see that painting again without also thinking of Mrs. Gardner. I think it's the same at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, another extraordinary private museum with an eccentric way of presenting things. At the Barnes, it's very hard to look at all those magnificent Matisses and Cézannes without feeling the funky breath of mad old Dr. Barnes right behind you. The artworks themselves, whose greatness has to do finally with something stubbornly aloof and objective, something that cannot be co-opted, are temporarily reduced to the status of Barnes's pets. In both places, the cults of Albert or Isabella feed into a kind of knowingness that threatens to hijack the whole experience. It's almost a relief, in fact, to go from the Gardner or the Barnes back to a big encyclopedic museum like the MFA or the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Conceptually, these places may be expressions of the Enlightenment ideals of progress, disinterested inquiry, and edification. But in reality, they're not quite like that. They often feel, to me at least, more like an archipelago of fiefdoms out of the Dark Ages, like one of those maps in the opening credits of Game of Thrones. The art of China here, textiles and carpets there, Islamic manuscripts, 19th century French painting, arms and armour, African masks, one thing bumping up against the other, all of it imperfectly presented in differing degrees of up-to-dateness. You can navigate it all in your own way and come back, of course, to explore the dark, uncharted parts whenever it suits you. At Mona, in Tasmania, the sense of disorientation, the strenuous conjuring of mystery, are even more calculated than at the Gardner. There's no signage or wall text, no sense of an ordered progression. And while you are reminded of older styles of enchantment, the whole thing actually feels very new. And so you wonder, could it be that just as the encyclopedic museums gradually displaced the Wunderkammern, places like Mona might soon come to overtake the encyclopedic museums? Just last week, in fact, I noticed the BBC reported that the Brera Gallery in Milan was offering night tours of the collection in the dark, with miniature handheld flashlights, the only available illumination. But another thing struck me when reading Richard Flanagan's piece about Mona. In its strenuous attempts to get our attention, he said, and in its arbitrary juxtapositions of artworks from different eras and in different media, Mona may be less in tune with the Wunderkammer principle than with a much more up-to-date labyrinth, the internet. And so here we come almost full circle, and I do apologize for the labyrinthine path we've taken to get here. I think we're all still undecided about how much the internet represents, on the one hand, a kind of colourful coral reef or modern-day Wunderkammer, and how much it represents, on the other hand, a standardising force, where everything becomes data and is made somehow equivalent or homogeneous by all-seeing tech giants like Facebook, Google, and Apple. You can argue the case either way, but you can certainly feel that the internet's push towards a kind of flattened-out omniscience or knowingness is in conflict with the old idea of inner life. The big companies that harness the internet have made the world more connected, more convenient, more efficient. They've made it both easier to measure things and easier to market them. And they've made it easier to get help. All this is massively significant. But the new dispensation we live under has also accelerated a trend we were seeing before its invention. It's making us more distracted, and it's making the world more open to distortion and exploitation, more disembodied, and in a way somehow less real. Perhaps the thing about these two distinct visions, on the one hand, maximum illumination and transparency, knowing things in their entirety, converting them into currency, and on the other hand, darkness, mystery, and unknowing, the story not yet told, the coral reef not yet bleached, is that always in the fruition of one vision lie the seeds of the other. In the Wunderkammer lie the seeds of the Encyclopedic Museum, and vice versa. In the unified empire lie the seeds of balkanization, and vice versa. And in the internet's archipelago of private interests and disparate activities lie the seeds of centralized, corporatized homogeneity. And in democracy itself, one could even say, lie the seeds of either anarchy or authoritarianism. But in saying all that, I'm getting way above my pay grade. When I think about my life as an art critic, about the role I might play in communicating valuable things about art in art museums, I'm often unsure about how much energy I should put into educating readers, helping them feel more knowing, and how much I should try to stay true instead to what I feel most mysterious, to what I find most mysterious and moving, to the things that remain enveloped in darkness, the things that are most resistant to words. Here's another Robert Adams image from Summer Nights Walking. Hermann Hesse wrote something that often comes to mind when I ponder this dilemma. It goes like this, and I'm almost at the end. Oh, how incomprehensible everything was, he wrote, and actually sad, although it was so beautiful. One knew nothing. One lived and ran about the earth and rode through forests, and certain things looked so challenging and promising and nostalgic. A star in the evening, a blue harebell, a red-green pond, the eye of a person or a cow. And sometimes it seemed that something never seen yet long desired was about to happen, that a veil would drop from it all. But then it passed. Nothing happened. The riddle remained unsolved, the secret spell unbroken. And in the end, one grew old and looked cunning or wise, and still one knew nothing perhaps, was still waiting and listening. As I grow old and try to look cunning, but probably just look increasingly bewildered, I find great comfort in those words. Picasso said that to search means nothing, to find is the thing. But I'm pretty sure he was just boasting. Most artists, I think, see it differently. In a travel log that predated the breakup of her marriage, Rachel Cusk wrote about her family's decision to uproot itself and move elsewhere. Our friends, she writes, were sorry to see us go. They did not believe that we would find a place that we liked better, for it seemed obvious to them that we were afflicted with restlessness and with a love of the unknown that, in their eyes, was a kind of curse. Yet, writes Cusk, true artist that she is, I had a terror of my own, which was the fear of knowing something in its entirety. To seek held no particular fear for me. It was to find and to know and to come to the end of knowing that I shrank from. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, of course. Yes, so I would be delighted to, I realized that was an unusual kind of a talk. I'd be delighted to take any questions about that or about anything. And if you do have any, please feel free just to move to the mics, which I think are positioned at the side of the auditorium there. If you're all baffled and have absolutely no questions, that's also completely fine.
Hi.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Oh, over here, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Oh, no, you can start.
No, I don't have a question.
Okay. I was wondering if you could talk about, in the idea of the Barnes or the Gardner or even Glenstone, which is a local museum in Potomac, Maryland, this idea that they need to become more accessible, so they build these additions to them, which, again, kind of, I'm not sure what the word is, denude or something, their original intention by making them more accessible and having all those added extras for parties and so forth.
Right, it's a great question, and thank you. I mean, it's the reality is that I sort of began, I suppose, thinking a lot of these woolly thoughts of mine to do with this subject when the Gardner Museum built its new extension. And it was just so striking that it was a kind of glass transparent box designed by Renzo Piano, who, by the way, is an architect I really admire. But it just seemed so out of keeping, in a sense, with Gardner's vision for her own museum, which already, was quite different from the museum as it was when she put it up. A lot of those trees and other aspects of the kind of opaque interior, and certainly the carriage house, are no longer there. The Gardner explained it as a kind of yin and yang, which made sense. It can sometimes backfire if you try and copy the style of something that was made a long time ago. But it was partly done because I think a lot of people, when they go to the Gardner and to some of these other smaller museums that you mentioned, but especially I think to the Gardner, find themselves complaining about the fact that it's too dark and that they're a little confused about what's important and what's not. Is that a real Velázquez or is that a copy? A copy, actually, but or a workshop of Velázquez in the case of their work there. And there's a Giotto here and it's just confusing, along with a lot of sort of trinkets and knickknacks. Of course, I find that a great part of the charm of the place, and I've spoken about that. But there is pressure, I think, to make things more in line with people's modern expectations of not just modern cultural venues, but of shopping centres and restaurants and so on. We have expectations which are more and more sort of developed and in a way more sort of uniform. Even when we travel overseas, I mean, there is a uniformity in the amenities that we see in other countries. So there is that pressure, and I am very sympathetic to it, and I don't want to seem at all critical to institutions that feel the need to modernize in that way. I've lived through a period in New England where more than $2 billion has been spent on new museum additions, and I have to say, for the most part, I really like them. I think that they're, they were necessary in many ways, and they've been done tastefully and interestingly. So it is terribly tricky, but I do think that, just to finish off, that there is an enormous pressure in, perhaps less in DC, but in museums around the country, which depend on private philanthropy, to always be coming up with some sexy new building project in order to guarantee that philanthropy keeps coming in. Because it's a very competitive philanthropic environment, and people don't really like to give money just to operating costs. They want something that, a new building they can put their name on or whatever it is. And that's all well and good. And in many ways, the envy of museums in my native Australia or in Europe where they're dependent on government funding. But it can create a situation where, of course, each new building increases the operating expenses, and it becomes harder and harder to kind of fund all of this activity and all the new amenities and so on. So I think that's a trap to watch out for. So sorry for the rambling answer, but thank you for the question. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you for such a thoughtful talk. Quick question, which may seem a trick question. Lucian Freud, would you view him as lucidity or darkness?
Ah, right. That's an interesting question because he, of course, hated what he called mystification. He really, he wanted to sort of paint every skin rash, every pore of the skin, and found incredibly novel, visceral ways of doing that. Without being sort of literally descriptive, he found amazing ways to convey that, which is part of what makes those works so affecting. And he loved to paint under uniform, often electrical light. So he didn't want chiaroscuro and, as I say, mystification. So in that sense, about light. But then when you think of it more figuratively, I think that one of the really striking things about his portraiture is that he seems to abandon the whole idea of psychological insight. This sort of old-fashioned idea that the eyes are the window to the soul, and that we can somehow know about a person's inner soul or their personality or their character from a portrait of them. He, more often than not, paints his sitters dead-eyed or even asleep. And he talked about wanting to paint the head as if it were no more important than a limb. So I think that was part of the source of what I think of being his originality. I mean, in many ways, he's quite a conventional-looking figurative painter, but he really pushed that idea of the unknowability of other people to quite an extreme. And I think that, for me, just rings true. I think it's very hard when we look at other people to, even people we know and love, to really know what's in their mind and in their heart. And that's one of the mysteries of intimate life and social life, I suppose. That would be my answer. Thank you so much for the question. We're probably out of time, are we? Sir, if you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it. I realized my talk was on the long side.
I'll ask quickly. I was struck that when you described the exhibition that you saw early on of the pedestrians, you used the word tender or tenderness, and you also used it when you were talking about Siri, I think, and I think you were quoting someone, but you're talking about it like electronic communication that we're much more used to having now. And I really like that word, tender or tenderness, and I don't often think of it myself in relation to art objects. So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about that. And also it struck me that that is likely to come from either another person, like the people you saw in representation, those pedestrians, or our phone, or what have you. Yet most of your talk was like a kind of desire for an inner life.
Right.
And I wonder if you could talk about the possible relation between those two things, or if it's likely that we are just going to find that kind of tenderness from art objects or our phone, or etc.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a tough one in some ways to talk about, which is why I did so much talking around in the talk. But yeah, those works are by an Australian photographer called Bill Hansen, and I just find that even though they're pictures of crowds, and in the modern city we often think of those sorts of images as expressing a kind of alienation or, someone being lost in the crowd. There is a way that he's somehow made those pictures, and the blurriness and the way light pools around, particularly hands and faces. And there's often, I only showed you 4 or 5 of them, but there are dozens and dozens of them, and being surrounded, enveloped by them was so powerful. There's often moments where they're touching one another, and I think in that touch there's a tremendous sort of tenderness. That painting, I didn't say who it was by, but you may have recognized the painting by Chardin called The Young Schoolmistress. That actually was one of Lucian Freud's favorite paintings, and he did copies of it himself, both in etching and in paint. And I think he loved that because of its tenderness. It has this extraordinary what's the word? It's a kind of almost complicity and compassion between this young schoolmistress and the little student who's sort of she's teaching. It's very hard to explain what that quality is and why it's there, where it comes from, but I find it very powerful. So, yeah, I mean, to me it was just interesting to think about when I talked about the, Siri and this sort of harvesting of information. I mean, you think of that film Her that had Joaquin Phoenix in it. There was this idea that a disembodied, kind of algorithmically created imaginary person could actually express tremendous tenderness and could make someone feel loved. It was a very interesting idea and a really persuasive kind of film. So that was the connection, I suppose, I was trying to draw there. Thank you all so much. We've got another question, please. Yep, one more. Thank you. And then go ahead.
Thanks so much for your talk. I really appreciated your championing of the inner life and how museums can sort of help to nurture that on a person-by-person level. So I just wanted to ask you if different writers or critics that sort of echo some of the things you talked about or talk about, approach criticism in a either holistic way or a personal way, not necessarily sort of structural or academic criticism, including some of that, but if there were a few people you might recommend.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, of course, there are, I definitely have, favorite critics, but also not just critics, as you say, people who write beautifully about art. And I'm a big reader of fiction. As I said, I'm really slow, but I do love it. And I guess writing about art, I've always loved Peter Schjeldahl. I just think there's a risk-taking in each sentence that he writes that, you feel like there's never a wasted word. And, that's just a literary feat. And these combinations of words and his originality with words is something that, whether he's talking about things to do with inner life or not, it's just powerful. And so often it just gets inside me. Someone like Dave Hickey, I think, writes really well about so many different subjects, with art as an obvious love, but also about all sorts of other things to do with the culture at large and with his particular loves like jazz and so on. James Parker, who doesn't write about art but writes about almost everything else in The Atlantic, has a column in The Atlantic, and he's a friend of mine, is one of the most brilliant writers I know anywhere. He's English originally, but he's lived here in the US for a long time. And then, yeah, look, my favorite writer's probably similar to many of your favorite writers. Whenever I sort of feel at a loss, I'll pick up a short story by Chekhov. I talked a lot about Rachel Karsk. I realized she's been a big discovery for me this year. I've read a lot of her stuff now after that initial recommendation. And I could go on, but Alice Munro is definitely one of my favorite writers. So, fairly unsurprising perhaps loves, but they really are, I just admire them so much. And yeah, writing is something that I think it is something I bring to bear on my response to art, and yet the best art, as I continually said, I think really does elude words so much of the time. So that's the challenge of being a critic. But I think it's a worthwhile one, simply because I know that, and perhaps this is just the biggest, most obvious justification for writing about art that is there, and that is that I know that I personally have been so affected by great writing about art, and that it's opened up worlds for me in a way that really has changed me, and which I can only hope to emulate. But thank you so much for the question. And thank you all for coming, and thank you, Clarice.